rather than ask questions from up here, what I was told I should do is to just open it up to the floor and let you ask the questions. But what we'll do is we'll take a couple of questions first and then allow the panel to respond. It's coming around.
Hi, my name is Nicole Wells. I'm a graduate student at American University. My concentration is in democracy and governance, specifically focusing on illiberal democracies. I'm reading Stephen Levitsky's and Lucan's Ways, their book on competitive authoritarianism. And I'm kind of interested in sort of, Anton or Ms. Berman, like what your thoughts are on the US maybe at risk for being an illiberal democracy, and maybe if populism is one explanation as to why maybe Central Europe is becoming an illiberal democracies.
Okay. There's a
several questions. This
I'm
question.
going to take a few and then.
Okay.
you can respond.
For Anton Chekhov.
Yeah, just down to.
Because Kathy Schneider, American University. You raised the question about why did Putin start supporting the far populist right? And I'm not sure you answered it, and I want to know, I mean, is his idea simply to destabilize? Because he also has support in the United States from the ultra-left, which has helped him just as much. Or has he, ideologically aligned himself with the far right, or does he see them more likely to favor his agenda?
Let's take one more and then.
Hi, my name is Peter Waldheim. I may be the only example in the room, I'm not sure, of the much detested neoliberal here. But I got my start in the civil rights movement, spent many years working there in the South and the North with street gangs, with prisoner recidivism, with all kinds of issues. Worked for the Democratic Party and all of its DNC, DCCC, DSCC, etc. And there are two comments, one made by John Judas and one made by Professor, I'm sorry, my eyesight's so bad, Berman, which I want to emphasize. John Judas began by saying that we in the progressive community need to not just run around, talking about the Trump voters and why they hate women, why they hate African Americans, etc. But we need to focus on some very real issues that are driving, whether misunderstood or not, they're driving much of the support for Trump. And Professor Berman just talked about the fact that that this idea that somehow or another this rising electorate of millennials and African Americans and Latinos, etc., is going to save us from that is something of a myth, because no one knows exactly where they're going to vote or how they're going to vote. In fact, the millennials and the Latinos who voted in this last election, when checked by exit polls or when queried by exit polls, had the exact same percentages, 68% of people who said that they were either conservative or moderate. 68% of Latinos, 68% of millennials, either conservative or moderate, meaning that they can be picked off. And then lastly, a few of the speakers have used the term white supremacy everywhere. Where it's everywhere, it's nowhere. If we can't tell the difference between people who are truly white supremacists, I've dealt with the Ku Klux Klan, I've dealt with neo-Nazi parties and so forth, I know what it looks like. If they can't tell that from neoliberals or something else, then we are hopelessly lost in the fall.
Okay. You want to start, Anton,
Yeah.
on
I'll start with the second question, why Putin started to support the far right. There are several explanations for this, and I think just strengthen each other. I think I finished with the thesis about the legitimacy. And when I tried to trace when those relations started to develop, they started to develop from the need to have external legitimacy. So basically the problem for Putin's regime since 2005, 2006, but even more so after the invasion of Georgia in August 2008, was that not so many mainstream politicians in the West were still ready to endorse Putin's regime or say that it's a normal democracy or striving democracy. But Putin still needed that legitimacy and that approval from the West. And they realized, especially first in the media, in the Russian state media, they realized that their best allies would be the far-right politicians from Austria, from Germany, from all over Europe. So this is how it started, to have an approval from the West or from Western politicians. It developed, however, in a very interesting direction after, you see, I would call Putin's regime a kleptocracy from the very beginning. But after 2005, 2006, it also developed into a right-wing authoritarian kleptocracy. So there was this ideological basis on which Putin's regime could agree with some of the theses of the European far right. And also Putin realized, and he mentioned this in his several speeches and addresses, that he would realize that Russian nationalism was not very good for Russia because it would create some sort of polarization in the Russian society. So understanding that and supporting the far right in the West, it means that Putin's knowingly brings polarization to European nation states. It's not that the far right would not have existed without Putin, but Putin's regime looks at different European or Western societies, finds the weak spots and tries to exploit them. When you say that the Kremlin interfered in the US presidential elections, well, still the US citizens elected Trump and not Putin. So it's just finding those weak spots and exploiting them is the modus operandi of Putin's regime. Yeah. And there was a question about liberal democracy. I haven't studied the US from this perspective. Liberal democracy is usually the term that is being used to describe Hungary and probably Poland at the moment, but at the next panel we'll have a speaker who will talk about Hungary in more detail. I'll probably leave this question to him and to Professor.
You want to
Sure. So, I mean, this concept of a liberal democracy is elusive, but I think very helpful. And what I think it's obvious, I mean, on the surface, what it's getting at is the question of what the relationship between liberalism and democracy is, right? Can you have democracy without liberalism? And surely you can, right? You can have democracy in the form of, elections and majoritarianism without liberalism. And why this is connected to populism is because that is one of the defining characteristics many social scientists have identified precisely of that phenomenon, which is these are people unlike fascists or national socialists, and we should definitely not throw those terms around, who very much claim that what they're trying to do is revitalize democracy, right? They're trying to make it responsive to, quote unquote, the people. And they are not anti-democratic, but they are often profoundly anti-liberal. But I think just because they are, and obviously none of us in this room presumably are, we should not take the critiques about, as I was trying to indicate before, the critiques about the current functioning of democracy and its lack of responsiveness, we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I think that yes, this is a good way of understanding what differentiates, let's say, populists from truly anti-democratic, movements on the right or the left of the in the past. And I also think that thinking about how to make democracy responsive in ways different from the suggestions made by, let's say, right-wing populists is the way to kind of restore faith in democracy, and in particularly in its liberal democratic version. I would also like to, if I might respond to this gentleman over here. Obviously, we should not conflate white supremacists with neoliberals. There's no connection between the two. And moreover, just as we hate on the right that there's a tendency to demonize your opponents. It's not just that I differ with you on policy, it's that there's something evil about you. That is just deadly for democracy. Democracies cannot work if people engage in that kind of behavior, and we definitely, therefore, should not be doing that on the left either. I may dislike neoliberalism and think it embodies a misguided set of policies, but I do not think that someone who advocates them is evil, and I believe that we have to and must have conversations and compromise, otherwise democracy cannot work. So I don't want to give you the impression I was conflating those two groups. I doubt John Judas was either, but I think the larger point that you make, that we really need to avoid on the left, just as we condemn on the right, this tendency to demonize our opponents. There are bad and evil people out there, but not everyone who differs from us is, and if we can't reach out to them, if we can't have conversations with them, then we can't be Democrats with a small d either. It just doesn't work that way.
Three more.
I'm Mark Levinson from Service Employees Union. Anton mentioned the word plutocracy, which, as applied to Russia, which, somewhat oddly hasn't been mentioned much in this conference. Because one question is, can democracy coincide with plutocracy? The United States is becoming, if it hasn't already become, a plutocracy. And a plutocracy, at least defined by massive economic inequality, which then has the effect of skewing a nation's politics, where the plutocracy essentially dominates both parties, which you can argue has happened in this country, which then I think accounts for the kind of extreme polarization of today's politics. If the party system doesn't represent a means to respond to the plutocracy, then you have then politics has to operate, and movements have to operate outside the party system in order to bring about change. Now, if those movements are ultimately to succeed, they have to succeed through parties. But we are kind of in the moment, it seems to me, where the response to plutocracy on both the left and right is kind of taking place, outside traditional parties. And so the question is the relationship between plutocracy and democracy, and have we had examples where democracies turn into plutocracies, which then once again can become democracies? It should be on the table here.
Hi, I'm Gustavo Beres-Bedi, and a question. So, demonstrably in this country, the right is sort of explicitly anti-democratic, and they push policies that are explicitly anti-democratic, like gerrymandering and voter ID laws and things like that. And so I'm wondering if you guys can speak to, with your various fields of expertise, we have organizers here, we have people who've studied Europe, we have a political scientist, which is nice to see. What do you do when the other side is sort of like, their end goal is to not have sort of a full open contestation of any kind? So what is what would be effective strategies or policy responses to people who are trying to get away with democracy?
And then there's a third.
Ben Ross, Chair Maryland Transit Opportunities Coalition, but not really relevant to what I'll say. I was struck by Mark Levinson's comment and thinking of that in the context of Russia, because I was spending a lot of time there in the 1990s, and what was clear to me was that what happened in 1991 was sort of the falling away of a husk of ideology that was dead, and you wound up with essentially the same people in charge saying, why should I own it indirectly as a member of the Communist Party when I can own it directly and take vacations in France? And it sort of immediately transitioned after, kind of a little bit of a real democratic flowering in the last years of Gorbachev into a plutocracy. And that is really what made it so vulnerable to Putinism, in my mind, or a lot of it, not all of what made it vulnerable to Putinism, but a lot of it. And it's a scary thought in the context of what's happening in this country.
So,
Well, first of all, I did not mention plutocracy. I mentioned kleptocracy. This is this is the term that I would use to describe Putin's regime. I would agree with you partially about that. Yeltsin's era actually prepared the ground for Putinism, but in a different way. When Yeltsin gathered a team of so-called reformers, the neoliberal reforms were so fast that the population became impoverished very quickly. And people who had very high status in the society during the Soviet times, they lost their jobs. And people who were engineers, who were doctors, the professions that would be valued very highly in a Western society, they had to work as, in shops, in retail, and some of them would even just, sweep the streets. So the neoliberal reforms, or the pace of those neoliberal reforms, create instability. And when Putin came to power, his basic promise was, I will bring stability again, but you have to forget about your political freedoms. That was like a pact with the devil. People, of course, were so desperate that they agreed to that contract. But in the end, they lost both their political freedoms and their economic stability.
someone want to react to the plutocracy comment?
Well, Mark, we all know that the power, that wealth is not only much more concentrated in the United States and other advanced industrial economies, but that it's much more easily translated into political power in the U.S. than it is in many other places as well, for all kinds of reasons that we all inherently understand. The role of money in politics, yada, yada, yada. This is, as one of the panelists mentioned earlier, one of the things that Clinton was vulnerable on. Now, the irony that she lost out to a corrupt billionaire, okay, fine. But, it made her vulnerable at a time when a lot of people were pissed off about the role of bankers and the wealthy in politics, much more resonant after the financial crisis than before, and it made her vulnerable in a way to attacks that she would not have probably been 20 years ago. A lot of people have talked about the U.S. in precisely this term, because what we have now is a system where economic power is much more directly translated into political power than it was before, and this has really skewed policymaking outcomes. It's skewed the nature of the political elite, as I said before. And I think most people, even though they don't have the opportunity to spend 2 days at a conference like this, inherently understand that both the political and the economic systems are increasingly stacked against them. And they vote because they're pissed off and they're looking for someone who's going to change things. As someone said before, the major reason that those voters who flipped from Obama to Trump gave was that they saw Obama as an outsider, as someone who was going to come in and shake the system up. And that explains the seemingly bizarre behavior of voting for Obama and then, voting for Trump, because what they were looking for was, change. And that's what, they are hoping that Trump gave them, regardless of what else came along in that package.
I just wanted to offer caution about terminology here. So we use the term neoliberalism assuming it's commonly understood. And in fact, in the American context, it isn't commonly understood. It's something that we borrow primarily from the Europeans, where it clearly represents a policy of austerity, a policy of undermining public institutions, a policy of replacing public goods with private goods and marketization. Because liberalism means something different in American politics, and at least since 1945 has been a general description of politics on the left, I think people become confused often when we use it in the American context. And to the extent to which we just throw it about as this kind of all-purpose descriptor of something we don't like, it aids in that confusion. So, I mean, for myself, I actually try to avoid using it in the American context and to actually talk about the specific policies, the austerity, the undermining of public institutions, the advancement of markets, and
Deregulation, all of that stuff.
deregulation, all of it.
Yes, all the way in the back.
Hi, my name is Maurice. I want to can I give a similar sort of caution about language with white supremacy? So it seems like maybe there's some tension in like using white supremacy to describe particular things, and perhaps that's because of a conflation of the term white supremacy with Nazi or outright racist. And that is certainly not the totality of white supremacy. And I think us shying away from calling things out as white supremacy actually does a real disservice to all of our movements and is actually a slap in the face to people of color who've been struggling through a system of white supremacy since this country was founded. And that system doesn't actually need Nazis to operate. It really helps speed shit up, but it doesn't need Nazis to operate. The housing crisis wasn't orchestrated by Nazis. You know, you can go on and on. The prison industrial complex wasn't designed by Nazis. So I just wanted for us not to shy away from using that term at all, because it's a really important concept to struggle with if we're going to struggle through the crises in both democracy and our economic and racial justice systems in America.
We have to wrap up. I'm going to give somebody else just one chance at it, and we'll allow the panel to.
The question whether democracy here, when you said Obama was the change. Terry Schiff with the National Public Education Support Fund. You know, that Obama was the change. I'll use my teacher voice. Oh, okay. Whether democracy, Obama the change candidate, now Trump the change candidate. You know, Trump will not deliver for folks. I mean, he will just double down on this redistribution of wealth upward and disinvestment. So where do we go from here? Where do you think the prospects of our country are? Do you see any, where's the hope for you now in terms of an electoral change or a real change?
So I'll give each one of you 1 minute to sort of quickly respond as a way to end this. So, where's the hope?
I could simply say that I believe that the conversation this morning between Randy and Mary Kay gave, I believe, quite some interesting insight in what they believe and what I believe could be an effective strategy to win back some of what has been lost or what is going to be lost. And if you would allow me, I would also like to respond to a question earlier about what would be effective strategies. You know, I don't think there's a universal strategy, a universal solution to to this problem that we are facing. But I do believe that it is very important to remember that in many cases, in many situations, in many countries, it has been the labor movement that has in fact mobilized those who ultimately found ways to restore democracy or to establish democracy. I mentioned Poland. I mentioned Chile. I mentioned South Africa. I mentioned Hungary. And recently, in the Middle East, Tunisia, for example. In Egypt, I mean, it's all not perfect, but there have been labor unions that have taken the forefront in establishing rule of law, restoring democracy in these places. So, you know, we should not give up hope. And I do believe that Randy and Mary Kay explained to us this morning that there are ways and that we should not, you know, give up hope.
And just closing remarks.
I just keep, Trump is not my area, really.
Hope in the world.
This is your guy. This is your guy.
Deal with it.
Okay. So I think the hope is, with us in this room, I think the hope is like Bernie Sanders being by far the most popular national politician right now, the way people have responded to his campaign, the way things such as universal health care and free college education are now in the public discourse, and as much as they try to tell us it's a distant possibility, like we actually are having that conversation, whereas it's just like shush, whenever you said it before. Hope was with Jeremy Corbyn and the UK, and how well people are responding to labor. Hope is with Black Lives Matter and all these other movements showing, you know, a real strain of not accepting austerity politics and wanting and demanding more, especially among young people, even though we don't want to leave it all on us millennials, like, we're going to do what we can to change things.
So I'd say that hope comes from the fact that right now, if you talk to people who are supporting Trump in the US or right-wing populists in Europe, they're mostly motivated by negative feelings. That is to say, it's not so much that they believe in what Trump stands for in any concrete way. Precisely as you said, his policies are a mismatch that actually, if you examine them, are unlikely to do anything for many of the people who he voted for. Similarly in Europe, people are pissed off, they're resentful, and they're fearful. And it's not so much that they believe in something positive, it's that they're very much upset with the current reality. If the left is able to come up with something better to offer these people, a more attractive vision of how to deal with contemporary problems and of what society could actually look like, there is every opportunity to win a significant number of these people back. That is to say, the people who aren't genuinely outright racists and neo-Nazis. But you don't beat something with nothing. And so if we in this room don't have a better vision that can attract a lot of these fearful, resentful, and discontented people, along with all of the other groups that we want to support, then we have nobody to blame but ourselves. But the opportunity is there, I think.
So, with that note, thank you very much.